Welcome back to the Podcast Interview Marketing Show. I'm your host, Tom Schwab. And today we're diving into a game-changing strategy that most podcast guests completely overlook. It's how to maximize your interviews by repurposing them on your own website. You've heard me say it before. Don't just do more interviews. Do more with every interview. Now, if you're spending 30 to 45 minutes of your time sharing your expertise on a podcast, but you're not turning it into that content on your blogs, for social proof, for lead magnets, well, you're leaving a massive opportunity on the table. That's why I've brought Tiffany Meenk, our marketing manager here at Interview Valet, to break down 6 powerful ways that you can take your podcast interviews and then turn them into long-term marketing assets. From blogs and books pages to a featured to section, and always the podcast welcome pages. If you've ever wondered how to get more ROI, return on investment, from every interview you do, this episode is for you. Let's jump in. You'll often hear me say, don't just do more interviews, do more with every interview. And today we're going to be diving into this and all the great things that you can do on your website from a podcast interview. Today we've got Tiffany Meenk, our marketing manager, with us to share her insights and her wisdom of working with all of our clients on this.
Yeah, great to be here, Tom. Absolutely. I think what we're going to talk about here, just in really maximizing your podcast interviews and really getting that ROI, return on investment, with your not only your money but your time spent as well.
Yeah, and it's about getting more from everything, right? I'm an engineer, so return on investment is how can you get more out and put less in. And for many of our clients, well, I'd say all of our clients, right? Time is their most constrained asset, right? So if you've invested 30 to 45 minutes on an interview, plus all of the time to prepare for it, make sure you get the most out of that. And really, that's all about podcast interview marketing. So why don't you dig into some of the great ways that you can use this content on your website?
Absolutely. There's lots of ways. This is something that I have worked with our clients the most about in my conversations with them, in their questions that come up. It always focuses around kind of a couple of central points, right? How can I repurpose this on social media and on my website? And I know we've talked a lot about social media in other conversations. And so I think with the website, there's so much potential there. If you think about it in terms of your, as a piece of real estate, right? You have this website. We know that anybody's customer or client, your website can kind of make or break you. I think all of us, before we purchase anything today, whether it's a coach or consultant or a contractor, any of that, we're looking at, their website. What do they do? How can they serve me? How have they served others like me? And so your podcast interviews are probably already answering all those questions that your potential clients have. You just got to get it over to your website so they can see it and really optimize that content that you've already created.
And I think this is great because a lot of times people are like, oh, you repurpose it to put it in social media. Yes, and so you can use it on your website, your marketing, your sales, and there's so much great ways that you can do that. And we'll go through these here that don't take any more of the talent's time, right? We always talk about the talent being the guest, the speaker, right? Let them perform, let them do this in the 30, 45 minutes, and you'll be amazed how much return you can get from that. And that's one of the things, with the high-level CEOs, they're like, you did all of this with 30 to 45 minutes of my time. Let me do another interview.
Yeah, absolutely. And we always talk about, we have to remind a lot of people that podcast guesting is not a sprint. It is a marathon. It's a long game, but you're also creating long form and long-term content, right? Like you just mentioned, if you talk on a podcast for 30, 40 minutes, that is a treasure trove of content that you just created. And while posting it on social media is great, you can get few posts out of each interview if you do a video or some graphics or things like that, and you can post them and they're one and done kind of on your social media. But if they're on your website, it ties into that long form, long term content, right? It has a piece of real estate on there and can be there as long as you need it and as long as it's relevant to kind of your directive.
Yeah. The thing about it, most people speak, say, about 150 words per minute. 30-minute conversation, that's 45,000 words of content that you can use in all kinds of different ways. So why don't you start digging into what's the most common way you see people using that?
Yeah, absolutely. I say offhand, there's about 5 or 6 really great ways you can optimize your podcast interviews on your website. Probably the most known, most obvious is the blog, right? Or if you're a nonfiction author, doing some kind of a book summary page or something like that. And in the media page, a collection of your best of all of your best interviews, your most prominent interviews. And to tie into that, you can also do, embed a Spotify player, create a custom playlist on there. There's also creating guides or resources. A lot of a great, and I always consult our clients with this, but a great lead in with new customers is 7 great things you need to know about XYZ, right? You can take that from a podcast interview and run it through and create a guide like that as a lead gen tool. And then lastly, something that we're major proponents of is the podcast interview welcome page, which is what I talk about the most with our clients and guide them on. So we can dig into those more and what they mean and how to develop them. But I would say offhand, that's the 6 primary ways you can maximize your podcast interviews.
Well, let's go through each one. Blogs, right? Everybody knows about blogs. I've written a whole lot in my life. They all felt like homework to me. So how can you create blogs out of podcast interviews, and why should you?
Well, they help also the landscape, right? Or the real estate on your website. It gives it a permanent space. And it also, if you're using SEO based words for your industry, it helps give you more backing with Google and search engines. So if it's 20 things you should know about podcast interview marketing, anytime somebody Googles that or is trying to get to you, right, find you, that's going to boost your rankings on Google. And really, things like ChatGPT and all this AI has made writing blogs so much easier than before. I've been writing blogs for many years myself, and I think back to my early days in marketing, what that looked like to now is very different. You can download your transcript from your interview, run that through ChatGPT, tell it to focus on this, emphasize my expertise on this, find 10 best practices that I mentioned, and it makes it so easy to quickly turn that around.
And I'm showing my age here. We used to hire interns, right? You hire a journalism intern from local Western Michigan University and say, here are the 26 interviews that I did over the last 6 months. Listen to each one, summarize it, and write a blog, right? That's what they do. They're used to writing newspaper articles. And so they listen to the event and they write the article about it. Well, you can do the same thing with Fiverr or Upwork, or you can use AI. And a lot of these people now are using AI. So they'll run it through there first, and then they'll put that human touch on it. But yeah, it seems so easy to do now. I can't believe that not everybody is doing more with their interviews.
Yeah, and I think people have a hesitation there with the AI that, is it taking away that human touch? But we are big proponents of using AI wherever possible, but we know that's not the final draft, right? It's really great at helping you get that first draft. And then you go through and add your tone and your, human touch to it, so it doesn't feel so mechanical, even for the reader as a blog on your site. So yeah, I mean, we're not saying AI should replace you, but it's a journalism intern that can help you get that first draft.
It's a tool like any other one. And I know some people are using it even to help them write books, but I love how you say, take the podcast interview and then, especially if you've got a nonfiction book, and write some content around your podcast interview so you can send people back to your website and not just sending them to Amazon.
Yeah, this is a great thing we advise our clients with is, oftentimes we work with a lot of authors who are wanting to drive sales for their book, which is great. But we're like, create a page on your site, a standalone page, whether that's in the primary navigation or tucked away behind the curtain. But that way you're at least driving traffic to your site rather than just the Amazon, right? Hey, go find my book, Podcast Guest Profits, on Amazon. It's over here. Or you can drive them to your site and boost your rankings. And another reason why this is beneficial, not just driving traffic to your site, but also oftentimes when you're on a podcast guesting, you have to have some kind of bridge or connection from that podcast over to your site. So if you're taking that opportunity to derail them over to Amazon, they're not going to get an opportunity to explore you more, right? What other things does she have to offer? Who else has she worked with that's like me? So if you send them to your site and they have your navigation up there, they can carouse around and learn more about you. And that really is in line with the concept of what podcast interview marketing is, right? Getting to know someone, building that connection. So it's just another thing that I think is easily overlooked, but really makes a difference in terms of impact and results.
Yeah. And it's how can you spend more time with your ideal prospect, right? Because you know that when you get introduced to the right people and they get to hear you for a while, that business converts, right? And there's a lot of things with Google Analytics, time on page, what's an indication of a buying engagement. And one of the things we've seen with this is when they're on their page looking around, that's a buying indication, right? And we can see that the longer they spend looking around, the more educated they are before they get on that discovery call. And, it's almost not a discovery call, right? They know more about us than we know about them. It's more of a qualification call. And one of the things that we've seen that's worked really well is we call it the in the media page or the featured on page, right? Go to our website, go to resources, and then in the media, right? And there's probably the key 6 or 8 topics that I speak on. And Tiffany's put them all there. You can listen to them, you can watch them, but they're all there. And you can sort of see before I get on a discovery call with someone, it's like if they've spent a lot of time on that page, I know that is a hot qualified lead because they're doing the research. Can you talk a little bit more about that? Because this was really your brainchild to put this on the site.
Yeah, absolutely. And it really came from feedback from our clients. This was a recurring thing that was popping up in my conversations with them. Because we talk a lot about welcome pages, which we can dive into more in a little bit. But in my conversation about welcome pages, they're like, well, I want something more forward facing on my site. I want to give it more of a permanent space and a feature area. And that birthed the idea of why don't we offer this? Let's look into how we can roll this out logistically, because it makes perfect sense, right? You're going on these shows and you want to feature it somewhere. So as you mentioned, in the media page will be like your highlight reel, if you will, of your favorite, most prominent podcast interviews, maybe one that really went really well. You had a good rapport with the host, really identified what you are and who you are, really encapsulated that. And it's all right there in one space. And it gives it a permanent spot. I think the concept of this page is a lot more common for speakers. If you're looking at a public speaker site, you're going to see featured on there, or, speaking engagements. Because that's their brand, right? I'm a speaker. Here's some of my best speaking engagements. And so that's what an in the media page is for a podcast guest. It's my best of, and it's a really great way for people to learn more about you, right? You think about how much someone can learn about you within that a 130-minute podcast. Well, now you have 6 or 8 there listed that they can pick and choose what they want to see.
You've curated them very well. And I think this is another thing of why you have to do podcasts on a topic, not just doing the same interview over and over, right? I refer to them as Groundhog's Day interviews, right? And you can see this where people go on, they talk about the same thing over and over and over. Well, after I've listened to 2 of your podcasts, it's like, I think, oh, this guy only knows 30 minutes of content. Or you can't repurpose it, you can't promote it because I've already heard that stuff. And I love how in the media page, you've started to curate different ones, right? If you're a brand, right? Or you're trying to build your personal brand, right? We got the interview there with Rory and AJ Valet, right? So, oh, boo, I know them and they're talking about personal branding. That's great. If somebody comes to us from category design, boom, right? There's one there focused with Christopher Lockhead, right? The father of category design, where we dig into that. If it's a nonfiction author, they're like, oh, Smith Publicity. Yeah, they're the big agency around launching nonfiction books. So there's different ones there. And so I don't know that everybody would read or listen to all 6 or 8 there, but they could scroll through really quick. It's like, oh, that one's important to me. And so that's another reason to do topics, do focused interviews, not just doing, this is Tom and this is his story. Now, the background story is interesting. Do one podcast on that, but at the end of the day, people want to know, they're focused on their problem, not your solution.
Yeah. And if you think about it, most people work with more than one type of client, right? If you're a coach or consultant, if, for example, you might work well with investors or with people in finance or with people in real estate, or whatever your primary verticals are. Like you mentioned, you can feature all of those there and capture who's actually on your page, right? In a way to connect with them on a more personal level rather than just the overarching theme of what you do.
Yeah. And even if it's the one different or one ideal client profile, there's probably key ways and you do that, right? So you could do, podcast on overcoming imposter syndrome if you're an executive coach, right? Coaching your followers, right? All the different ones, the power of a mastermind, whatever it is, you could talk in there about that, and people would say, "Oh, that one speaks to me."
Mm-hmm. Touching on their pain points and their solutions that they're seeking from you. Absolutely.
And then you've got this one. I think, I don't know, this could be a little bit more of an ego thing. When you put it at the bottom of the page there, it's like the Spotify player of all of my interviews. It sort of feels like when I'm picking the year for my birth, when you do that, and I just spin to get down to that. The same way with the podcast interviews. After you've done dozens and dozens, right? You have all of those in there, and it's like, wow, this person is an in-demand thought leader. Talk to us more about that Spotify playlist that you built.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think this is one that might get overlooked, just like we talked about the book summary page. It may not be on everybody's radar as much as, a featured on page, but it's a really great way, even if they're just scrolling and it's an ego boost, it shows this many podcasts were willing to share me with their treasured audience, right? Podcast hosts work very hard to gain listeners and maintain their audience. And they all wanted to share their stage with me. And so it's a great way to do that. And also just, even if they're not sitting there listening to your whole playlist of, I don't even think we could do a playlist for your interviews, Tom. You've done so many, but they're not going to listen to all of them, but it's building a social proof and authority there, right? Just like speaking on a physical stage where, oh, I spoke at this event and this event, I did a TEDx talk, all of that, it builds your authority, right? This guy was great enough to be a TEDx speaker. Okay, he has some affluence there, right? And the same goes with the podcast. Oh, he was able to get on Lockhead on marketing. Okay, there's some affluence there. So the same thing applies, but it's a great thing to do. Or you do have some people that just want to sit and binge listen to podcasts if they're podcast aficionados. It's just a nice feature to have.
Yeah, it's just amazing to curate that all together. It's like they may find those out there in the world, but why not make them one place on your site so they're there listening, spending the time on your site, giving the love there. And this next one here, we're going to go a little bit behind the curtain on how we build guides and using the podcast interviews to build guides. Can you share a little bit about that, Tiffany? And we could probably talk about our last one that came out this quarter too.
Yeah. Okay, so to take it from step one, over your journey of podcast guesting or any, speaking engagements that you might do, you're going to find commonalities or common questions or complaints from your clients, right? We've seen this many times where just from your discovery calls, conversations you have with prospects, there's going to be common themes that come up, which is my favorite thing that I get to do. And that's, I'm always like, let's do a thematic analysis. What's the common words they use? And one that we noticed more recently coming up for us was kind of that stage fright, introverts, right? And we got to looking and we're like, okay, a lot of people who are attracted to podcast guesting rather than other forms of media are more introverted personalities. And so we went on a campaign with that, and that actually drove our latest guide, which is the Introvert's Guide to Podcast Guesting, right? What are some unique obstacles that introverts have in terms of, doing public speaking on podcasts and things like that?
When you start with a guide and you start with a blank piece of paper, that's tough. It's like, well, where do I start with this? So we start thinking about it a quarter ahead, right? And some of our best clients are doing this too. So back in the end of Q3, we're like, this is a theme that's really coming up, right? This is something we're hearing from our clients, from different people. So if we're going to focus on how introverts make great podcast guests and how they can leverage this, what experts can we pull in on this? Matthew Pollard, right? Matthew wrote The Introvert's Edge. Great expert on that. We had him on our podcast. I went out on some different podcasts, the leading introvert podcasts, and had the discussions there, right? And their hosts were adding things to this. So now we recorded those, beginning of Q4. They start coming out toward the end of Q4. Now we've got the interview with Matthew. We've got the ideas that we've put all together. We've got 3 or 4 interviews of transcripts. We've got all of this content. Now it's like, okay, we've got this content. How do we boil this down into a guide? And so we're not starting with a blank paper. We're starting with, these are all the things that were talked about last quarter. Now let's start to put them into a guide. And, behind the curtain, what's happening right now? Well, in Q4, we're like, man, have you noticed that ChatGPT is becoming like our best referral source? And our clients are saying that too. Podcast interviews allow you to, get found by the large language models. Okay, let's do all the research in Q1. Let's talk to people. Let's interview them, right? We did the interview with Sam Malakarchanan from Agent AI over at HubSpot. Let's get all of that information. Let's go out on podcast interviews. And guess what? In Q2, you're going to see a guide that comes out all focused around that. So once again, it's the interviews, right? They didn't come to me and say, Tom, we know you don't like writing blogs, but could you write a guide, a 20-page guide on the definitive guide on this? that wouldn't get done. Better to just say, yeah, we talked about that last quarter, summarize all this stuff and put it together.
Right. And the benefit of doing that rather than you, Tom, just dictating a guide yourself, right, or typing it out, is you're getting other people's feedback and what their questions are, right? So it's not just you're giving information on it, but it's the host pinging questions to you. They're thinking it through. Okay, you're talking about introverts. What about introverts who do this or who are afraid of this? So you're getting real-time feedback in developing your guide. Right? What are people asking about this? How are industry leaders driving LMO? And so then you can incorporate that into the guide. And then it's more customized to the questions, solving the whole problem of what a guide, resolves is you're answering their questions, right? We want a guide. We want 10 things I should know about introverts on podcasts. Well, there you go. You've gotten it. So it's a really great thing. And then it also goes into the concept of what we talk about differentiating between podcast guesting and podcast interview marketing. So podcast guesting is showing up, talking for 30, 40 minutes and walking away. You're done. Podcast interview marketing is you're building it into your overall marketing strategy, right? It becomes an ongoing piece of your marketing goals and intentions. So building out those guides, you're building out your marketing content, your library, your lead funnels. Because if we're like for us, we're developing the introverts guide, that's because a lot of our clients have that problem. So now when people are Googling or searching these things online, or they're on our site and they're like, yes, I am an introvert. I want to know more about that. It's another way to connect with them and meet them where they are, which is really the ultimate goal with all of podcast interview marketing, right? It's not salesy. It's not to sell somebody something, but it's to connect with your ideal clients who are out there looking for you already.
We've been in business now a decade, 10 years, right? The founder story has been told, right? It's an important story, but it's already out there in the search engines, in content, Chat GPT. You can ask them that question. There's the founder story, right? I get bored saying that over and over, right? After a decade, right? But you can always talk about what's the next thing, right? That's what's interesting. If I can ask ChatGPT a question, I don't need to go to a podcast to listen to it. So this way you can make it, like you said, marketing, not about, what are we going to focus on next quarter, right? And let's start talking about that this quarter, and making it very, very strategic on that. And for a decade, we've been talking about welcome pages. And it's every time I hear somebody hear about it for the first time, they're like, oh, that's genius. I have never been doing that. And I'm like, all right, we got to get this word out. And I know a lot of times when you're working with our clients, it's like, oh, yeah, why wouldn't you give a dedicated page so you can attribute the traffic from every podcast interview? That's one of those, like I always say, don't do more interviews, do more with your interviews. And a welcome page is so important to that. We've done entire webinars on that. Can you give a brief overview on that? And, I'll look up where the webinar is so people can find that too.
Absolutely. We can make sure to link it in the show notes. This is the number one thing I talk with our clients about is the welcome page. But essentially at its core, a welcome page is a dedicated page on your site, customized for each podcast interview. And it has all of that information that your listeners are going to want, right? So it has the podcast art, which is a key to it working, right? That social trust there. Because again, it's about building the connection from that show, that audience over back to your site. So it opens with the podcast art, the custom podcast art to that specific show. It's a short welcome letter, right? A little bit, let me introduce myself. It's your headshot. A lot of times podcasts are listened to audio only. So this might be their first time putting your voice and name with a face. Has all your socials and your direct link to your email, whatever you want to put there. And then at the bottom, it has your 3 calls to action. So it's, what it does is it encapsulates all those things. When you get to that pivotal part of a podcast interview, when the host says, "Where can our listeners find you?" This is usually where a lot of guests drop the ball, because they're, find me on LinkedIn over here. Here's my website. Here's my, Twitter handle or X handle, or here's my email. Nobody's going to remember that. But if a welcome page puts all of that in one spot, and again, it's about meeting those listeners where they are. It gives you, if they prefer Facebook over Instagram, they have that opportunity there. So it's really just about building those connections and giving them every opportunity to learn more about you.
If you want to learn more about the welcome pages, just go back to interviewvalet.com, the resources, and you can download it right there. Heck, ask ChatGPT. This has been ripped off and talked about so many times that it's the common knowledge there. How to use welcome pages to track your ROI or get more ROI from a podcast. Well, Tiffany, you went through the 6 things there. And those are the tactical, right? And you talked a little bit about each one. This is how you do it. This is why you do it. But let's step back the macro level, right? We're not just doing podcasts for an activity, right? We're doing it for the results. So putting all of this content back on the website, big picture, what's the thing we're getting out of it? What's the benefit? Why should we invest the time and the money to do this?
Well, again, you go on a podcast to connect, right? To expand your brand, to reach broader audiences. And then with that content, a lot of guests are leaving a lot of opportunity on the table. So all these things we've talked about here, as I said in the beginning of our discussion, is to really just maximize your impact, results, and reach with each interview, right? Giving them permanent space on your website to really feature your expertise. It's great for building that social proof and authority, right? The benefits of a shared stage. We've talked to Carrie Wilkerson many times about this, and she talks about, the 5 C's of getting paid from podcast interviews. And she talks about this, when you share a stage with someone, say you're a TEDx speaker, you're put in the same room, in a same box with all the other TEDx speakers. So the same goes on these shows, right? If you're on a really amazing show, you're put in the same room with people of that affluence. And it's like, okay, he's knowledgeable enough to be on the same tier as, this amazing person. So it really builds your authority and gives that social proof, just like case studies or testimonials would, and that's why they're all important.
Yeah. When she was saying that, I think of, once again, showing my age, as seen on television, right? As seen on TV was this stamp. It's like, oh, it must be good. It was on TV. Or even the same way, I haven't had a TEDx speech. It's one of those things that I would love to do, because I could say I was on a TEDx stage, right? If I said I was on a Tom X stage, people would be like, what's that? Right? But because you were on a TEDx stage, that is that authority there. And it's funny, when we first started 10 years ago, I give my my elevator pitch and people go, what's a podcast? Right? And now here we are, 2025, the election, whatever your thought is on that, it really proved the power of podcasting, right? And now it's almost like I was on a podcast is more powerful than I was on TV, right? I was on TV. People are going to say, well, which station? And they're going to love you or loathe you, right? Whereas a podcast is like, wow, that's great. So make more out of every interview. Just don't do more interviews.
Yeah. Well, we always say, more isn't better, only better is better. So it's about really just maximizing what you have created already. And you're not having to recreate and reinvent the wheel every single time.
Tiffany, thank you so much. What's ordinary to you is amazing to other people. And I love how you talk with all of our clients, right? So you not only have our experience at Interview Valet, but all the different clients. And that's one of those great things about expertise, like David C. Baker talks about that. You see the same patterns, you see the same opportunities there. And that's a big part of what this podcast is about, is sharing those best practices so that you're getting more from every interview, right? Because our mission is to personally introduce inspiring thought leaders to millions of people they could serve for the betterment of all. Getting this content repurposed is for the betterment of all.
Absolutely. Yeah. I love talking about it. I love talking about it with our clients and with you here on a more public forum, so more people can learn these tips and best practices. So thanks for having me, Tom.
Wow. What an episode. Tiffany just gave us a masterclass on how to maximize every podcast interview by using your website as a content hub. Think about this. If you're spending your time sharing your insights on podcasts, why wouldn't you repurpose that content into SEO-friendly blogs, social proof on your website, lead generation guides, and always the podcast welcome pages? It's the difference between just being a guest and truly leveraging podcast interview marketing. So here's the next step. Pick just one of the strategies that Tiffany shared today and implement it. Create a blog, update your media page, or build a welcome page for that next podcast appearance. And if you want a step-by-step guideline and breakdown of how to do it, head over to interviewvalet.com/resources. We've got the guides and the tools waiting there for you. Because remember, what's ordinary to you is amazing to others. No matter where your product or service is at today, I don't care if it's version 1.0 or 10.0, there's someone praying for that today. The only problem is they don't know you exist. Your audience is out there, and it's time to stop being the best kept secret. Make the most of every interview. Until next time, keep showing up, keep sharing, and keep growing.